Thanks for being here with us today. I hope you can hear me clearly. Okay. My name is Zhongjin Li, co-director of the Asian program in the Political Economy Research Institute, PERI, at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and also assistant professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I'm thrilled to welcome Isabella Weber and all of you to the launch of Isabella's new book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate, which is officially published today by Routledge. Isabella is assistant professor of economics at the UMass Amherst and the research leader for China of the Asian Political Economy program at PERI, which has kindly hosted, along with the Department of Economics at UMass Amherst, this event today. Isabella has a PhD in development studies from University of Cambridge and a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research. Her work combines economic theory, economic history, and China studies to examine the interaction between economic thinking, policy, and long-term structural change patterns in periods of deep social transformation. Today, we have the great pleasure to launch Isabella's new book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. China now has become the second largest economy and the fastest growing trillion-dollar economy. It is deeply integrated into global capitalism. This was definitely not the case roughly 40 years ago when China was on the crossroads of the 1980s to make a crucial decision. Should China destroy the core of the socialist system through shock therapy, pushing big bang price reforms, or should China use the institutions of the planned economy as market creators for gradual change, cautiously and pragmatically later known as groping for stones to cross the river? It is well known now that China soon embarked on an economic expansion commonly described as unprecedented in scope and pace, whereas Russia's economy collapsed under shock therapy. However, what is much less well known is that the decision process was by no means uncontested or without a fierce debate in China, which anyone who's interested in understanding the Chinese economy should not bypass or dismiss. As the book contextualizes China's market reform in the long Chinese intellectual tradition, the World War II and post-war era, as well as the communist revolution and the global economy, and uncovers how China escaped shock therapy and has achieved remarkable development via gradual marketization, we are quite honored and grateful to have three distinguished panelists in these fields to join us today. Professor James K Galbraith holds the Leo M. Benson Jr. Chair in Government and Business Relations at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and a professorship in government at the University of Texas at Austin. In the 1990s, he served as Chief Technical Advisor to China's State Planning Commission for Macroeconomic Reform. Arbin Wong is director of the UCLA Asia Institute, distinguished professor of history, and the author of China Transformed: Historical Change and the Limits of European Experience. Branko Milanović is a senior scholar at the CUNY Stone Center on Social Economic Inequality and served as lead economist in the World Bank's research department for almost 20 years. Thank you very much for joining us. The plan for today's event is to start with Isabella to present her book for about 15 minutes, followed by the commentary from Professor Galbraith, Wong, and Milanović, each for about 10 minutes. Then we'll open the discussion and conversation to everyone for about 30 minutes. For this event, please note the chat function will not be available for the audience. Please post your questions in the Q&A function. Although in the chat function, you can find the relevant book information and the related talks. At any time, you can post your questions, but please let us know who you are and what organizations you are affiliated with. I'd also like to thank Caitlin and Evan at UMass to help us manage the technical part of the talk. Okay, without further ado, Isabella, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Zhongjin, for this warm welcome. My book poses the question how China escaped shock therapy. This question came to me when I was working at a foundation in Berlin on the China desk. I attended meetings with Chinese delegations from various institutions. At times, these meetings included former cadres from the German Democratic Republic. The Chinese delegations were very interested in the fate of East Germany. The question of how could history have played out so differently in the two countries was an obvious question in this context. As a student of economics, I became interested in the economics of China's reform as one piece in the puzzle of this larger question. When I first started to research the intellectual foundations of China's market reforms, most historians still considered the 1980s not quite as history. Political scientists thought of the 1980s as too far in the past, and the study of non-Western economics is only just now gaining some momentum in the history of economic thought community. It was by no means a straightforward task to find a home for this PhD project. In this context, some individuals were crucial in encouraging me to pursue my research on China's escape from shock therapy. I would like to thank in particular Rebecca Karl Riskin, and Lin Chun. Peter Nolan took me on as his PhD student at the University of Cambridge. His relentless support of my project made this research possible. On this journey, many people in China and around the world took time for long interviews, sometimes stretching over several meetings, and were kind enough to share documents and notes they had collected over decades with me. I have listed their names in the book, and I am indebted to all of them. As I was turning this research into this book, the endorsement of my project by James Galbraith, Wong, and Branko Milanović were crucial. Thank you so much for being with me here today. The economics department and the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst have been a wonderful home for the final steps along the way, and I would like to thank all my colleagues. Many thanks also for hosting this event today. When I started this research, there was no way for me to know that this book would be published in the context of the fear of a new Cold War. The confrontation of the great ideologies of communism and capitalism is over, and yet the tensions between the United States and China have reached a worrying height. China has deeply integrated into the world economy, but it has not undergone a wholesale assimilation with the neoliberal model that became dominant in the West. China has served as a workshop for global capitalism for decades, but the ambition of China's leadership has long gone beyond turning its people into the world's largest working class. China's market reforms were ultimately not simply about marketization, but about reindustrialization, economic catch-up, and development. This becomes clear from studying the debates in the first decade of reform. In the late 1970s, China was in search of a new economic model. The ambitions for continuous revolution of late Maoism had faded. The attempt at a renewed big push industrialization under Mao's designated heir forgone had failed. China was still a very poor country with a GDP per capita less than that of Haiti or Sudan in 1980, and a share in world GDP around 5%, a level that was basically unchanged since the revolution. China's reformers quickly gravitated towards the need for more markets. Already in 1979, Deng Xiaoping argued for the compatibility of markets with socialism, thus creating legitimacy for marketization. There was a sense among the reformers that China had leaped too far ahead in revolutionizing its relations of production and now had to take a step back and make up lessons from capitalism. China's reformers agreed on the need for marketization, but they were sharply divided on the question of how to introduce markets into an urban industrial economy that had been organized based on the ideal of one national workshop. As I develop in detail in the book, two reform paradigms emerged: the logic of shock therapy and a gradualist market creation by the state. What was at stake in this debate is illustrated by the contrast of China's rise and Russia's fall. China entered a period of growth that is commonly described as unprecedented in scale and pace. In contrast, Russia's transition recession was deeper and more prolonged than the Great Recession in the United States in the 1930s. The reform approach that came to be called shock therapy was, simply put, the idea that the old institutions of planning had to be torn down in one big bang in order to make space for the market to emerge. This reform logic is based on the neoliberal premise that the state and the market belong to two separate spheres, and that a market economy requires for the state to make space for markets by protecting and policing that space from the outside. Fundamentally, the first step in this reform approach was meant to be overnight price liberalization, especially of the most essential goods. Such a big bang in price reform was meant to be the initial shock of shock therapy, in line with the notion of getting the prices right. An efficient market economy would in the first instance require rational prices. The intellectual inspiration of this reform approach came from visitors like Milton Friedman, Eastern European emigre economists disillusioned with previous gradual reform attempts, and Chinese students of cybernetics and computer science, as well as, of course, neoclassical economics. While this shock therapy-like reform approach was being minted into blueprints by academic economists, agricultural reforms were in full swing and unleashed a dynamic of marketization from the margins. Initially, planned quotas and prices were left in place, but the production responsibility was moved from the commune to the households, thus undermining the institutional base of the Maoist political economy of agriculture. If households managed to produce more than their share in the plan, they could sell on the market at market prices. As the countryside was thus growing into the market demand for consumer and producer goods emerged in the urban economy. So industrial production units also gradually entered into a dual-track system of plan and market. Initially, this dual-track marketization was only tolerated in non-essential downstream industries, but eventually the same logic was transferred to the core of the industrial system, the upstream producer goods industries, coal, steel, electricity, etc. In the urban industrial economy, this marketization approach was premised on adapting the existing institutions of the planned economy in the core sectors to become market creators and market participants, rather than to cut the ties between enterprises and state to make space for the market as shock therapy would have it. This gradual dual-track reform approach was not invented by any individual economist. It grew out of a logic of loosening control in ways that let the core of the plan running in the first instance. But as the market dynamic took hold, that core itself was transformed. This logic builds on a long legacy in China of state market participation that becomes apparent in the traditional granary system and that was mobilized in the communist economic warfare against the nationalists in the 1940s. But this reform approach was not Chinese in an essentialist sense, nor was it detached from economic research. Careful empirical study of the experience of other countries, as well as the experiments with reform in China itself, were crucial in carving out this reform approach. This included the post-war transitions in the United States, the United Kingdom, and West Germany, the reform attempts in Yugoslavia and Hungary, among others. Economists were also essential in debunking the shock therapy approach when China came close to implementing a big bang in price reform in 1986. They warned that overnight price liberalization would unleash hyperinflation, destroy the plan without, however, creating a functioning market or serving the project of reindustrialization. In 1988, there was another attempt at a big bang. This time, the situation spiraled out of control, creating the economic context for the political meltdown and the massacre on Tiananmen Square in 1989. The gradualist reform economists stood loyal with Zhao Ziyang, the key architect of economic reform in the 1980s, as well as with the protesters. Most of them lost their position. Many were exiled, some imprisoned. China's shock therapists were quick to turn the blame on Zhao Ziyang and emerged influential in the 1990s when reforms were restarted. However, by that time, the basic path of reform had been set. There were far-reaching neoliberal reforms in the 1990s, but no wholesale shock therapy. As we have seen in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Chinese state maintains the capacity to create, participate in, and actively steer individual markets. It no longer governs primarily through direct planning or commands, but through a fine-grained, goal-oriented channeling of market dynamics. It looks more and more like China's distinctive reform approach that I have researched in this book has created a new kind of economic system. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, great. Thank you. Thank you, Isabella, for the great book talk. Now let's welcome Professor Galbraith for comments. Okay. Okay, James, it's your turn.
Yep. Thanks very much. And it's just a great pleasure to be here on this occasion. For readers who are seeking a window into the rise of modern China, this book is, and there really is no other way to put this in my view, a miracle of depth and precision. And if I may deviate for a second from talking about the book to saying a word about the author, Isabella Weber combines traits that are equally rare. One of them is the training of a very richly educated economist who understands the historical traditions of our subject. And the other is those of a researcher who has both the ability and the will to dig deeply into Chinese sources, both in print and in person. And the result is the book that is being published today. In it, she is able to break free of the polarizing prism of Western debates over China and these cliched characterizations of what kind of an economy is it really? Is it socialist? Is it capitalist? Is it market socialist? Is it state capitalist? Or even is it communist if you take someone like Ted Cruz seriously on the subject? These things are not going to give us an appreciation of the country that we see in front of us. What does she find in this book? And basically, I would argue there are two big things here before we get into the discussion of the historical developments of the late 70s and 1980s. The first is a classical Chinese tradition of price control and stabilization. It goes back thousands of years. A process of storage and release to stabilize the basic products, commodity products of the country, combined with a vast integrated internal market unified by water communications. This was very well known even to Adam Smith, who writes about it in The Wealth of Nations, and administered by officials who were chosen largely on the basis of some demonstration of merit. In addition to that, she finds a modern Chinese industrial administration that took a fair amount of inspiration from, of all places, and she mentioned Germany and the United Kingdom, but also substantially from the United States, and specifically from the very pragmatic World War II Office of Price Administration, a point which obviously caught my interest in a rather deep way because the director of the OPA from 1942 to 1943 was my father. And very much engaged here in the ideas of how you run an economy under pressure without allowing inflation to get out of control. And these two factors, combined with their own experiences and a desire for political and social survival, recognizing fundamentally that in a one-party state led by a communist party, inflation is an especially lethal threat that would undermine the whole basis of the legitimacy of the state that had been established from the revolution forward, and which had been in the recent past gravely threatened by rash experiments of other kinds. So a combination of their own historical experience, their outside study, and their political instincts enabled China to entertain, but ultimately to avoid the idea of a big bang, which was being urged on them by Chicago economists and East European ideologues, amongst others, at the time. My direct contact with all of this didn't arrive until 1993, which is outside of the time frame of this book, but I'll say a few words about it. Because at that point, as Isabella Weber writes, the gradualists had largely been dispersed. Many of them had been exiled. They had run into severe political problems as a result of the side they took in 1989. But it was nevertheless the case that the people who were still at the State Planning Commission, who I met when I became chief technical advisor on a UNDP contract on macroeconomic reform in 1993, were, first of all, they shared the horror that Isabella describes of what was going on contemporaneously in Russia. And it was clear that a very highest priority was to avoid having any such thing develop in China. And second, they were basically educated in this pragmatic tradition, including having ownership of many internally published copies of my father's books, which they duly asked me to sign when I arrived there. It's a token of friendship. Even though the academic economists in China at the time were already, those positions were already being taken over by repatriated disciples of Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman. In the center of policy, I think it's fair to say that a strong measure of gradualism and pragmatism still prevailed. I'll say a few things about the kind of people I was able to bring into contact at that time. In 1995, for example, Robert Eisner and Jane DiRista highlighted a conference at which liberalization of the capital account was discussed and discouraged, and ultimately not implemented, leaving in place an important policy tool for China through the Asian crisis and on to the present time. Other contributions in those years for familiar names known to the community, I imagine is in this audience, Teresa Ghilarducci came to talk and give a paper, write a paper on pensions and the establishment of a unified social security system. Stephen Cohen of Berkeley came to talk on industrial strategy. Michael Reich, also of Berkeley, came to talk and write on the role of independent trade unions. Luis Carlos Bresser Pereira met a Chinese delegation in Brazil to discuss the heterodox approaches to inflation control. All of this was very much below the radar. With what effect, I can't say. But I do know that when a piece of legislation on unions went through the National People's Assembly some years later, the American Chamber of Commerce in China opposed it. So that seems like a pretty good sign that maybe there was a little bit of influence there on the right side. But to come back to this book, in sum, it is an achievement of the first rank, and I cannot praise it too highly, for its contribution to our understanding of today's China, for its effective riposte to conventional views and what one might describe as the neoliberal propaganda machine, according to which all progress is based upon movement toward free and unregulated markets, something which is manifestly inconsistent with what we observe in China. And finally, and very importantly, because this book renders a degree of justice to a cohort of Chinese economists and pragmatic reformers of that period who might otherwise have remained forgotten. So we really owe a debt to Isabella Weber to just on a professional and let's just say ethical grounds for what she's achieved in this remarkable work of scholarship. And also, I have to say, a very excellent writing. This is a book which is widely accessible and just anybody can read it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, James. This is very humbling.
Thank you, James, for providing more historical details and for very helpful comments. The next commentary is from Professor Arbin Wong. So, Professor Bing.
Thank you very much. Firstly, it's a great pleasure and indeed an honor to be here to help express enthusiasm for Isabella Weber's new book. And to be sandwiched between two distinguished macroeconomists. So I was going to make a joke out of a concept in the Guanzi, but I realize most of you who are in the audience will not have read it, so the joke will fall flat. So it has to do with light and heavy. But leaving that aside, let me do this. Let me say that I'm going to end where Isabella began, noting that when she started this work, had no idea of where we'd be today, and the tensions that exist geopolitically in the world, animated in particular by those between China and the US. But to get there, I want to go back. I'll go through 4 areas as quickly as I can, but I want to go back to the US, go back before James's father was in the Office of Price Control to the 1930s. And this is precisely because there was another great American at that point, a man named Henry A. Wallace, who served FDR both as Commerce Secretary, Agricultural Secretary, and then as Vice President. And he was a journalist, a farmer, a businessman in Iowa. The reasons for mentioning that is he said in 1918 about the Chinese, quote, "If any government shall ever do anything really worthwhile with our food problem, it will be by perfecting the plan tried by the Chinese 3,000 years ago." And this is a man who is associated with something called he was inspired by his food policies, and this goes through the Agriculture Adjustment Act of 1938, some of the major New Deal legislation of which he was a primary advocate. There is in his background this awareness of Chinese practices from much earlier in history, which he credited in subsequent conversations with a sinologist to his reading of various Chinese writing that came out of Colombia in the 19-teens and 20s. In any event, it's to alert us to the fact that there was a certain time in American history where the notion of recognizing something the Chinese did that might be relevant and useful to know was actually very salient, in the same sense that symmetrically, Chinese were very aware that understanding what the US did during the war with price control, understanding the UK, the German, any number of experiences, they have consistently been, I would say, eager learners of different kinds of experiences with a very focused desire to see how those apply to the problems that they face. I'd also say the reason I raised Henry Wallace and the Evernorth granaries, that's something that comes up in Isabella's book as well in reference to Chinese political interventions in markets. And I also mentioned it because it's a subject I spent a long time writing about with a French scholar, French sinologist, in which I think we showed pretty conclusively that in the 18th century, China had this massive empire-wide system of civilian grain reserves that worked with some degree of success across a very wide space, the scale of Europe from the British Isles to the Ural Mountains, and always with a population larger than that of Europe's by at least 35 to 50% at least at all times. So if we think of that scale, it's not surprising that it's easy to criticize what the Chinese may or may not have succeeded in a practical particular situation, but the scale of that effort and the commitment to engagement with markets, I think is important to recognize. I won't go into any more particulars about that system, but I further want to then stress in the study of China, understanding of China, the so-called China watching community, this is very important for a larger audience to understand. China has had markets for a very long time, and it's had at various points in its history, robust commerce with various types of policies adopted by the state with respect to how that economy should work. This is not to belabor that point, other than to say it's very difficult to understand how certain people forgot that China ever had markets because they only look at China after 1949. And for 30 years, that particular state was reasonably enthusiastically at all, well, reasonably at all times and enthusiastic sometimes seeking to destroy markets. In my opinion, that's a real rupture with what had been a tradition in China of various sorts. And that is not irrelevant to understanding how the return of markets emerges. Having said that, let me go on then just to the next point. So what I'm saying is that not only is Isabella Weber to be deeply commended for recognizing the relevance of political economy discourse in ancient China, and the manner in which then it is repurposed, reframed, and understood in subsequent periods. And to be clear, I'm not trying to say this is peculiar about China. If you think about the European traditions, and you think of the way, certainly in politics, there is this persistent return and reimagination of what was said in the classical era. That's why we still care about Plato, we care about Aristotle, we care about the notions of republic, we care about the notions of democracy. These have been invoked, repurposed, and reimagined in various historical epochs, including our own. At the same time is that they're always vulnerable to other competing visions that have come up through time. And so what I'd say is that I'd like to stress the degree to which one, as an historian, talks about so-called continuities. I want to stress that, in fact, what this book shows to me is the persistent possibilities of invoking certain types of principles in radically different situations that those who don't know a part of the world's history will never see because they couldn't imagine such things could matter. And I would argue that is one of the gifts that Isabella's book presents us if we're willing to open the box and actually appreciate what's inside. Well, I could go on in that, but I want to keep track of time. So let me say why I think this really matters. And it's already been adumbrated both in Isabella's presentation and in James' commentary about the crucial importance of what this book tells us, not merely in my opinion about China in this early reform era, but it gives us an orientation of thinking about how the Chinese have approached and will approach in the future their possibilities both domestically and internationally. And by saying that, I'm by no means trying to predict what path they take, but I'm seeking to stress that I think they really have a menu of possibilities, among which we can't obviously predict what's going to happen, but we have deep incentives to understand enough about how that system works. And if we have any preferences, which I suspect most individuals would, that we're seeking to promote those possibilities that depend upon a fuller understanding and comprehension of how that system works. At least that's the point I'd make. To wit, I would say ever since the 1980s, with the increasingly tight grasp of an American-led neoliberal market approach, which has been just pervasive through economics, through so many disciplines and in politics, that as James mentioned, and certainly some, I admit they're friends who have gone back to China, are deeply fond of Hayek. And I've had several decades of confusion over quite getting my brain around how some of this works. But if we think back to the presence of Hayek and the Montpellier Society that he founded in 1947, I mean, when I studied economics in the 60s, these are the people who made Gardner Ackley, a group of people from whom I learned, would make fun of. And little did people realize then the degree to which much of the last 40 years has been dominated by this. And I would say that it really, the imprint remains with us as we move forward, as I think most in the audience would probably agree. And this matters for understanding China. So let me put this in the context then of East Asia and how we get to China today. I want to take us back to the late 20th century, to the 1990s, when the World Bank had figured out that it wanted to acknowledge that there was an East Asian miracle, and the Japanese economists who were involved wanted to note that state policies had a role. And of course, in that atmosphere, that was extremely difficult for an orthodox neoliberal approach to take. And there was great, as Robert Wade has shown in an article, that there was great contention over how this would be resolved. And in his way of putting it, it was the report, if you read it, this report on the East Asian Miracle from '93, you'll see that, yes, the state plays a role, but it's almost as if state interventions that least violated market efficiency and didn't play favorites, those were the best policies. Other economists, distinguished economists like Danny Roderick at Harvard have pointed out that the report is internally inconsistent. It says things that are mutually, that don't meet a standard of logic. So I think there's tensions in how the neoliberal order understands the possibilities of state roles in making markets. And within economics, and certainly the part of economics that affects my life, economic history, Douglas North and his version of this in the new institutional economics has been profound in setting people in a certain direction. And to me, the deep disappointment and frustration is that I think Doug North's absolutely right. Institutions matter. What matters as much is knowing that not only Anglo-American institutions matter, but everyone's institutions matter. And we have to figure out how and when they work well and how and when they work poorly. And I would say if you take that somewhat broader view of institutions, you not only can understand what, for that matter, how the French and German economies worked at various points since the 17th century, but you can take the measure and changing measure of different parts of the world. So having said that, that comes then to the last part of the comment I want to make, which is to say, in this moment of profound geopolitical tension between China and the US, and for that matter, which necessarily repositions the EU's positionality between the two and its relations with each, I think it's worth noting that the foundations of the early modern world order. So for those of you who aren't comfortable or don't commonly think historically, which I realize is 99% of the world, at least the Western world, or at least the American part of the Western world, including intellectuals. If we think forward from the 16th century forward, the way in which the European expansion across the world becomes the pursuit of power and wealth is an animating set of forces, I would argue, carries forward into the modern era. For the early modern period, we have no problem understanding that the relationship between states and economy was intimate, and that power and wealth couldn't be severed from each other in terms of understanding the dynamics of historical change. But certain Europeans, the British primarily, in the 19th century invented this great fiction that you could separate the two. And indeed, we enshrined in our academic disciplines from the late 19th century forward, at least the possibilities of recognizing in the social sciences these discrete areas of politics and economics. And American academia post-World War II, it seems to me, celebrated and affirmed that distinction in ways that create the boxes out of which many scholars have been seeking to move, at least between, if not beyond, for quite some time. And having said that, then, I'll say this, that in the late 19th century, the Chinese and Japanese were extremely aware of power and wealth, and they both conceived of their efforts, which had varied results from that period forward, but they conceived it precisely in terms of what they learned about European power and wealth, or rather that was a crucial component of it. Why do I mention that? Because today in China, well, today, I haven't been there since 2019, but certainly I can remember, on the benches along the street by bus stops, you would still see the slogans for power and wealth, the pursuit of power. I mean, the importance to promoting this as a crucial concept for understanding what state and society were about. So I think, in fact, that expression is not merely, it's only peculiar to China insofar as explicitly put together. It would seem to me that it's an indelible part of the contemporary global order. The geopolitical and economic concerns are too tightly enmeshed and entwined not to seek to understand how they're put together and the type of scholarship it takes to understand them in a manner that is more constructive. And so I see Isabella's book as very much explaining to us how state and policies can help enable markets work. And she explains to us what features in the Chinese intellectual tradition, and I would argue the institutional tradition as well, have allowed those to be focused in the manner they have in China. So let me say the relevance of this, not merely to understanding China because we should understand China, but for what we might want to think about how we pursue a better global, national, local order, spanning our social, political, and economic. And I'll do it by quoting, as it turns out, a fellow PhD graduate of the New School in economics, the Italian, well, I guess she's citizenship, an Italian-American economist who Isabella also acknowledges in her book, Mariana Mazzucato, who is a senior Labour Party economic strategist, a major figure in the UK. And this is what she says in a 2018 book called The Value of Everything, when she's commenting on the challenges of crafting a truly new Green Deal and what it requires about understanding public value. And this is what she says, and this is what I'll end with. Quote, state agencies, here she's speaking about the UK, the US, these kind of systems. State agencies can often fund basic science due to the positive externalities, but not downstream applications. Public banks can provide counter-cyclical lending, but they cannot direct their lending to socially valuable areas like the green economy. These arbitrary distinctions reflect a narrow view of the economy, which often results in a public actor being accused of crowding out a private one, or worse still, delving into the dangerous waters of picking winners. The state is only supposed to do what the private sector does not want to do, or I would put in parentheses, or is capable of doing, does not want to do, rather than have its own vision of a desirable and achievable future. And I would say what Isabella Weber's book has done for us is help us understand some very important part of how the Chinese are seeking to craft what they see as a desirable and achievable future. So again, thank you, Isabella, for such an important and timely book. Even if you couldn't predict the world into which it would finally emerge, as it were, you haven't given, as it were, birth to it. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Bing, for the great comments and reminding us the historical context and the geographical, or the broader comparative perspectives. Thank you. Now let's have Professor Branko Milanović to have the comment. Branko, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Of course, it is a pleasure to be here. I read Isabella's book also when it was in draft. I think I will not repeat all the praise that was already rightly heaped on the book. Actually deserves it all. It is a book which really, first, it's extremely well written. It's entertaining to read. It really starts, as Professor Wong has said, and Jamie, with a really excellent historical perspective, which is not only perspective on Chinese and somebody who speaks Chinese and also who can read Chinese literature can have, but also combines it with similar reforms in, as it was said, in the US, UK, Germany, and then Eastern Europe. Now, I would like to focus, for me, that was the most interesting part, having actually lived through some of these reforms in Eastern Europe, and how they then were reflected in China, and how in turn, actually, China influenced some of the attempts at the end of the communist system actually to learn from China, because it was really a two-way street throughout. So let me first say that, in my opinion, the book shows, of course, what we have all already pointed out and what is in the title, how China escaped the shock therapy. And of course, the contrast between China and Russia is striking. It was something that has been really mentioned from the very beginning, because in many respects, you would actually, if you were to give the data to somebody from Mars, he would actually might think actually Russia should do better than China. But of course, the very opposite happened. And not only did the opposite happen, it happened in a big way opposite. And not only did it happen, but it continues to happen. So this is the issue. We are actually now, 30 years after Russian transition, and we still have the same problems that we have in 1990. And we are like 40 years in the Chinese actually Chinese development of an incredible scope and pace, and it continues. So really the issue for economics profession, I actually talked about that, is overwhelming. It's like being present in the Industrial Revolution in England and then studying, as I was making a joke of that, studying not Adam Smith, but studying number of ships that came, to a harbor in Scotland. I mean, we actually have this elephant in the room, which is Chinese development, and we basically don't understand that actually, and there are not enough students of China and the Chinese development of economics to have actually brought this knowledge to us. So Isabella's book really does an extremely, amazing job in that respect. Now, let me just say one more, there is one more topic which is only mentioned in passing, but which also China escaped, luckily. So the first one, of course, is the Big Bang. But another one is really foreign indebtedness. And that appears briefly in the discussion of post-Mao era with Huo Guofeng, when actually there was this idea of a push, and the typical thing which actually led to many problems in Eastern Europe was then almost on the verge of happening in China. The idea, you borrow, then you actually produce domestically, import substitution and exports, but without any other accoutrements. And that, of course, as we know, led to default for Romania and actually draconian austerity measures that eventually brought Ceausescu down. It brought Poland to the solidarity, the state of emergency. Actually in Polish it's called the state of war, because Poland in the constitution did not have the state of emergency, which of course Chinese specialists would understand, because it was considered inconceivable that the people's state would have a state of emergency. So the only thing which existed was state of war. So officially it's called stan wojenny, which is the state of war. So that brought Poland to that position, and of course afterwards the default to the Paris Club and to the institutions. It brought Yugoslavia to a hyperinflation, which almost rivaled the German and Hungarian inflations of the after World War I. So that indebtedness and actually the Volcker shock, of course, as we know, brought Latin America also to its knees. So China, I think, was pretty close to actually getting into that rabbit hole. It did not. And then, of course, the most of the book is discussing, I think, 3 episodes where it actually came to the Big Bang. Now, and actually, I will not repeat, actually, well, of course, Jamie was the witness to some extent of that. And of course, the book discusses all of this, as also Professor Wong and Jamie mentioned. So I will skip that. I mean, let me finish with one thing which deals with East European emigre advisors. This is really purely speculative, so keep it as such. Think of the 3 parts of the reform. The first part is the classical sort of socialist economics reform on pricing. The second part is the question of property relations. And the third part is the question of the political system. So the 3 things really became connected. And in the view of some of the East European reformers, actually Isabella mentions Kornai, to some extent also possibly Strumiński, their belief developed, and I'm not talking now about 1990, because by that time they all became capitalists, but I'm talking about mid-1980s. But they developed this belief that once you start making changes in relative prices, you really cannot solve the problem, because the property relations are unclear. The state will still have, as Kornai called it, a soft budget constraint. You would not be able to control investments. So then you really have to have privatization and real ownership. Well, once you have that, then it's a bottom line question. Can you have an economy that says we are a communist ruled economy or state, and we have everything privatized? So that was really, I think, a conundrum. And actually what I was wondering with some of them, whether they themselves were not to some extent pushing China into a big bang, that's obviously speculative, in order for China to move and to realize that if you solve problem one, you have the problem two. If you solve the problem two, you end your system. So then I was wondering, to what an extent was it a sincere advice, or was it an advice which was pushing you in a direction where the answer was your whole system has to be changed entirely? So that was my speculation as I was reading. Obviously, I have no grounds to believe that these economists, the gentlemen, were actually doing that intentionally, but I have sort of become suspicious. So let me then end on that note, once again, praising really a great book, and actually, all three episodes of the Big Bang, of the shock therapy, are extremely interesting. And of course, the point that was mentioned by several people, how the careers and lives of the two groups really changed very differently from what some people actually have written before. In other words, it was the people who were in favor of gradual reforms that ended up exiled, but the people who were in favor of a Big Bang ended up really still having very important role in the Dengist China.
Yeah, thanks so much, Branko. Sorry to insert here. This speculation, of course, also has been on my mind, but since it's a speculation, I decided in the end to not include it in the book. But you have absolutely spotted a puzzle that I decided to not include in the end. But I do have some pieces of evidence that also point in that direction.
Great. Thank you so much for all your very insightful commentaries. Now let's open the floor to the audience for Q&As. Again, please post your questions in the Q&A function and let us know who you are and what organization you are affiliated with. We have already received many questions. So let's start from the first one. Since the book has shock therapy in the title, the question here maybe Isabella, how do you define shock therapy? This is from Chunling Zhang. How do you define shock therapy? Does it not have a component of rapid and comprehensive privatization?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great basic question and shows that I've rushed my talk. So basically, shock therapy is a policy package that would be comprised of various elements, as Branko also has just been pointing to, where the idea is that the first initial shock is overnight price liberalization in a so-called one big bang. And then this should, of course, be followed up with privatization and also importantly, trade liberalization. And macroeconomic austerity was meant to suppress a spiraling out of control of the overall price level, which turned out not to be feasible in most cases. So in that sense, the price reform element that I'm focusing on in the book is really the initial shock, the shock of shock therapy, whereas these other components are, of course, incredibly important, but are acknowledged even by the most radical shock therapists to take time, and as such, not to be that overnight, that big bang, that sharp initial pain kind of element. Would anyone else on the panel like to speak to that question?
Okay, let's move to the second question from Xing Fan, a historian from SUNY Fredonia. The question is more about a comparative kind of perspective. So far, this study sounds like primarily a China plus Euro-American story. I was wondering if you have discussed China's gradual and pragmatic approach in the context of East Asian model of development, say the reference from Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore. I also want to mention one of the other audience brought up Alice Amsterdam's work. So maybe you can comment a little bit on the comparative aspect between China and the East Asian model.
Sure. So in the context of price reform, the reference points seem to have been more the Eastern European context and the World War transitions rather than the East Asian miracle or the East Asian tigers or the East Asian development state, which I think has to do with the fact that the specific problem of how to move out from a situation of almost universal price controls is really more specific to these other contexts. This is not to say that the East Asian economies didn't play a role. I think that Japan in particular played an important role in relation to enterprise reform. And of course, the Chinese trajectory in the end does to some degree speak to the Asian developmental state trajectory and Alice Armstrong's work more broadly. But I do think that these specific challenges of a transition from a command or planned economy, depending on how you want to call it, to a more market-oriented economy really presented themselves in comparison to the transition from the Second World War planned economies and the price reform attempts in the Eastern European context. In relation to Japan, there is, of course, the Dodge plan and the immediate post-war reforms that were along with the Erhard miracle or the so-called Erhard miracle. Some of the examples that were invoked on the part of those that were arguing for the possibility of successful, rapid price liberalizations.
Great, thank you. The next question is also about kind of shock therapy in the broader sense from Nancy Faubre at UMass Amherst. Nancy said, didn't China engage in a kind of demographic shock therapy with public policies that led to rapid fertility decline and a very titled sex ratio, contributing perhaps to rapid GDP growth in the short run, but problematic prospects for the future? And it seems that labor force participation rates of Chinese women have declined over the past 30 years. Did any of the Chinese economists you spoke with talk about issues of population growth and or gender inequality and their implications for growth, economic growth? I think the other audience, Alex MV, if I remember your name correctly, you also pointed out the possible demographic prospects of the Chinese economic growth. So Isabella, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Nancy, for a great question. Let me also take this as an opportunity to say that my point is not that all about the Chinese trajectory is great. Of course, there have been enormous challenges in the realm of inequality, in the realm of social policies, in the realm of environmental pollution and all of that. As regards the more specific question of population and population control, this was actually something that came up in some of the interviews that I did. And as far as I understand, was not my primary focus. Maybe it should have been. As far as I understand, there was also a debate around the one-child policy. And in fact, some of the same people that were arguing for a dual track type of reform were arguing against the kind of planned one-child type of policy, which was derived from certain optimal planning population models of a not totally unsimilar type from those that were used to project blueprints for reform. And those who were arguing against the one-child policy were basically saying that if you were to impose a one-child policy that would be most strictly enforced in the urban part of the population and not as strictly imposed in the rural part of the population, simply because in the villages you could not contain, it was not feasible to limit the number of children to one. That would mean that you would exacerbate inequality in a very dramatic fashion because you already had an unequal level of incomes and wealth between the rural and the urban economy. Now, if you restrict urban households to one child and you basically force them to put all their resources into that one child, and on top of it, you have a hukou registration system that does not allow for people to move freely to move freely in the sense of changing their registration between the countryside and the city, then this would be a recipe for creating, or not really creating, but for reinforcing a division in the society that was already often referred to as a dual kind of society, as a division between urban and rural and the rural population. And in many ways, this is what has happened. Some of the people who were involved in the rural reforms in the early stages were also basically saying that on their mind, the agricultural reforms could no longer be considered a success, because what they had created was an army of some 300 million migrant workers that had no choice but to sell their labor at the most atrocious conditions in urban factories. And therefore, this initial enthusiasm about rural reform actually did not live up to the proof of time. So in that sense, yes, in regard to population policies, in not only the actual policy, but even the intellectual foundations of the one-child policy in terms of optimal planning type, using optimal planning type of models and all of that, is akin to the kind of intellectual foundation from which shock therapy in the more narrow sense of the word had been derived.
Right, so we have a few questions about the actual debate and the kind of the sources of the debates and how it is compared to the other economies. Justin Flux mentioned that many have compared China's reforms to Russia's new economic policy. However, from the presentations, it seems that many of the reformers got their ideas from the US and Europe. I'm wondering about the balance of influences on China's reforms. Did the inspiration primarily come from the West, or did they also draw from ideas within the communist world?
Yeah, great. Maybe we should also bring other members of the panel back in whenever you would like to comment on any of these questions. So yes, this is a great question. My reading is that in the 1970s, and in fact, even at times still during the Cultural Revolution, the new economic policy was an incredibly important reference point, and Lenin's late writings, Lenin's elaborations on state capitalism and all of that were important in the initial stage in moving out from late Maoism, moving away from the idea of revolutionizing the relations of production first, that is, aim for ever more socialist types of organization, and then basically have economic progress come about as a derivative of this revolutionizing of social relations. Moving away from this emphasis on this revolutionary focused model entailed the in-depth study of the new economic policy of Bukharin, of Lenin, and all of that. However, my impression from the interviews and the sources that I've consulted is that by the 1980s, the ambition was really more in line with the logic of making up lessons from capitalism rather than trying to replicate the new economic policy of the 1920s. Possibly not least because of where the new economic policy eventually led to. But in any case, my impression is that for the initial move to reform, these early Soviet debates were absolutely essential and were also crucial in creating a legitimacy for the possibility of having markets and having capitalist tools mobilized in the name of socialism. However, as reforms evolved, these earlier Soviet debates were more and more in the background. Branko, would you like to comment on that?
No, thank you. Actually, I was very keen to learn from you because I really didn't know what you just said. So thank you very much. I have nothing to add.
I actually was about to invite Branko to comment on that inequality question. Okay, so
yeah, maybe we should. Branko, would you like to comment on the urban-rural demographic inequality question?
So maybe in
or
the
James.
later round.
No?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, maybe in
James?
the later round.
James seems to be willing to say something.
Well, that, just in relation to that, and also to the question that was just posed in the Q&A about the nature of debates inside the Chinese system. Once you get behind closed doors, they're unbelievably open. The only thing I didn't encounter in the middle of 1990s was an actual doctrinaire Marxist-Leninist. Everything else was available, and if there was a Marxist-Leninist, they were silent. But that was a detail. It just every kind of position was represented, and very, very vigorously. Much more open and much more diverse than you would find, for example, at the American Enterprise Institute or the Brookings Institution. It just without any comparison. Just that it wasn't, it's not exposed to the public. And if someone gets up in front of a microphone, well, then that's a different story. But that's not a limitation on the ideas that are available to the government. And the other thing that impressed me at the time was that the very large role played by the technical community, by natural scientists, by physicists, by engineers, by people who had authority in these fields, and much more important on economic policy than those communities are in the West.
Isabella, can I just say one thing now?
Of course.
Very brief, 1 minute. One thing actually also what impressed me in the book, and we didn't mention it, obviously for lack of time, is I would say a fairly positive and good role that the World Bank played, which I think distinguishes that role from what the bank was much more ideological when the Russian and the Soviet transition happened. So I think it's very clear in the book. And I think the reason is that there was an ideological change which happened in the international organizations between 1980s, or actually the conference that you mentioned was, I think, 85, another 86, and the 1990s. So things really happened very quickly within these 3 or 4 years. And that's actually quite amazing.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning this. I think it's also important to remember that, to connect this back to your earlier point, right, that China was not indebted in any large sense. So therefore, the exchanges were really more of the nature of technical advice. They did have a certain direction and a certain taste to them, but they were not as top down and as monolithic as they played out in other contexts. Thank you for bringing this in.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is about, again, the shock therapy and the domestic context. So this is from Hiroki Takeyoshi from Southern Baptist University. For the institutional rebuilding in the 1980s, which resulted in escaping shock therapy, as the author shows, how much did the central government learn from local governments? There were a lot of institution building at the subnational local level to turn away from the Maoist system before then started the reform, the 改革开放, or the reform and open up at the national level. So Isabella, would you like to comment? This question?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Of course, there was a lot of local development that was quite distinctive, and there were different models emerging in the different provinces, such as the Wenzhou model, pioneering the idea of enlivening private enterprise and so on. And there is a certain divide in the literature where some argue that basically China's reforms were just a bottom-up process where the central government had the wisdom of letting people on the local level do what they wanted to do, and others dismiss that story. I think that we have to think this together, and in fact, I think that the research by economists was quite critical in linking the local experimentation and the emergence of local practices to national policy. And I think this becomes particularly salient when we look at the early agricultural reforms, where the Rural Development Group emerged as an entity that was to some extent really outside of the system, since it was composed of people who often weren't even party members yet, and who got the support from officials like Deng Liqun and Du Rongsheng and so on, who were holding their hand over them, giving them resources, money, and offices to do survey research, basically during the summer holidays, on the ground experimentations with the household responsibility system. And these kind of survey research activities played an important role in systematizing the insights of the local experimentation, but also in legitimizing these approaches that were emerging on the ground, since these researchers in this initial stage of reforms kind of appeared as some sort of a third entity that had the air of a certain objectivism, since their ambition was really to contribute to rural development, but they didn't have a position or stakes in the system beyond that. And these same researchers later on formed a very strong alliance with Wan Li and Zhao Ziyang and other top level leadership, leaders really, in a way that enabled them to have a direct connection with the top leadership and to continue to feed on the ground research results on local experimentations back to the top level, and thereby like build some sort of a bridge between things that were happening on the ground and broader missions and broader policy goals on the top level. So I think in order to understand this this somewhat symbiotic relationship between the drafting and designing of national policies and local experimentation, it's important to include these research exercises into the story. So in that sense, this is not economics, armchair economics, where a great economist sits in their office and comes up with a wonderful idea of how to reform the system. But this is economic research in the sense of on the ground, inductive survey research of trying to understand what the possibilities are given the very specific local context and local experiments.
Great, thank you. The next set of questions is more about the role of the state. And I think you mentioned some, and all three panelists kind of touched upon this question. So we have Marco Dondi from McKinsey mentioned that, does the book look in the role of state-owned banks in China to pilot the significant growth in the domestic money supply that enabled the most rapid economic growth in history? This question is kind of related to a larger question posted by Shiji Zhang from Politics Department at University of Sheffield. In the conventional debate regarding the conceptualization of Chinese economic transformation, neoliberalism and state developmentalism are two mainstream narratives. Your work has shown why and how China did not follow the path of neoliberal shock therapy. I'm wondering how you think about the state developmentalism narrative in this debate. Is state developmentalism more close to your conceptualization regarding China's economic changes in the last 40 years?
Yeah, these are great questions. Thank you. I mean, on some level, China's trajectory might actually be more market than state developmentalism would suggest, since the pattern that we see is really a very active creation and participation in markets and shaping policy outcomes through the participation often in specific markets, which links to the first question, where of course the banking system is massively important, but I think one specific aspect of China's monetary policy that is not often discussed and rather poorly understood possibly is that China is doing monetary policy not only through banking and through macroeconomic interventions, but is doing monetary policy through the stabilization of specific key prices. So for example, right now, we have seen that there has been an announcement that the Chinese authorities will crack down on the manipulation of the prices of steel, copper, coal, electricity, and so on, which is seen as the greatest source of possible cost push inflation. So instead of tightening monetary supply overall, which is seen from the perspective of the People's Bank of China as the means of last resort, you rather contain the rise of key prices that are at the verge of unleashing ripple effects further down the supply chain. Similarly, with pork prices in 2019, 2020, you saw the state stepping in, stabilizing the price for pork by increasing the supplies of pork. So really the state enterprises literally organizing the imports of pork in order to bring down the price of pork and thereby stabilize the consumer price index. Now, this means that you have a whole range of tools to stabilize the overall price level without having to go into monetary policy, which I think is pretty important in understanding how China has achieved such very high growth rates without inflationary dynamics, because whenever there's a small, really commodity level inflationary dynamic kicking in, the state steps in and kind of puts out the fire before it even can spread to the higher up levels. So in that sense, I think that we have to understand the banking sector in the context of this very different monetary policy framework.
I would just add to that, though, the Chinese state never adopted the monetarist notion that the central bank was the unique power that was aimed at inflation. And if they had, the results would have been disastrous, and they knew it. So precisely so. They also had the capacity in the banking system to make loans that to enterprises that might not in a Western system have been bankable, and just to pile up the unpaid debts and non-performing loan portfolios without destabilizing the banking system. That's the advantage of having a state-owned banking system and a isolation of the domestic financial system from the rest of the world. And the one other thing I would add that affects the capacity to manage things on the vast country on a decentralized basis is that the municipal and provincial governments largely control the land. And so they're able to earn the land rents and to finance the industrial infrastructural development in a way which was very largely decentralized, highly competitive between regions as to who could develop most effectively, because that's where you'll get the industrial investment, as by having the infrastructure to support it. And so the dynamics of the system were very different from institutionally from the structure of a typical Western federal economy.
Yeah, thanks, James, for adding that.
Right. So we have one question from Adam Hirsch. The question is a little bit about some kind of other internal reform policy debates. Adam asks question, Isabella, could you comment on the internal reform policy debates that unfolded between 1989 and Deng's Southern Tour in 1992? Who was influential and along which lines were the debates drawn? How did those positions change between the Southern Tour and Jiang Zemin's ascension?
Okay. If I had internal insights on that, that would be wonderful. I would be pretending things if I said I did. I think that what precisely happened between 1989 and 1992 is still a question for research, and one that I probably don't get into deeply enough in the book. I think one irony of the episode between 89 and 1992 is that even though it's generally interpreted as a return of the so-called conservatives. And in many ways, it might have been exactly that. At the same time, it gave a pretext to impose pretty harsh austerity measures, which basically had not been possible before, and which to some extent were helping in preparing some of the more radical policies that then followed in the 1990s. So there is this strange irony where the so-called conservatives are really preparing the ground for the return of pretty neoliberal forces in this period. Another interesting thing about the stabilization effort after 1989 is that, which is, I think, less emphasized in most commentary, is that we actually see again a return of an attempt to stabilize prices by indexing the value of money to specific commodities, to a basket of specific commodities. So you again have this return of the logic that the value of money is really what money can buy in terms of essential commodities, and not the macroeconomic relationship between a certain quantity of money and the size of the economy as a whole. So you get a return of that logic, which I think was quite important in the 1940 stabilization efforts, and which is also ingrained in the granary system type of logic that Bin has been referring to, where always the idea was that the value of money is really what money can buy in terms of grain. So if you are in an economy that is largely agricultural and largely organized around the production of grain and agricultural output, then the value of money is basically packed by the value of agricultural commodities that this money can buy, right? Now, of course, in 1989, it was no longer only about grain, but it was also about stabilizing the price of grain so that you get a combination of more conventional austerity measures with these measures that are really focused on re-establishing the value of money by pegging it to a certain basket of commodities.
Okay, so in the last 5 minutes, I just want to group the similar questions together and invite all of you to consider the comparative part. So a few people mentioned that, how China is compared with Chile, India, and Eastern European countries. So one question is saying, in Chile, we are soon to start the process of writing a new constitution by democratically elected representatives. We have a history of shock therapy and neoliberalism from the times of Pinochet, who implemented long-lasting neoliberal economic ideas in our economic and social system. Considering our constitutional process seen as a threat of or shock from the establishment and the findings from history, what elements do you consider need to be taken into account when moving in the opposite direction, that is from neoliberalism to possibly a more socialist approach in the definition of institutions and their roles? And other questions are about how China's gradualism compare with India's recent development trajectory. India has avoided the fate of Latin American and Russia, but not expanded like China. And also a question is comparing China and Eastern European countries, why Eastern European countries are not doing something similar to China or any of their East Asian tigers. Yeah, so I leave the floor to you. Yeah, all of you.
This is a very wide spectrum. How about we use this as a general point of reference and open up for last round of final statements? Maybe this time we should reverse the order, starting from Branko, Bing, James.
All right, let's see.
Okay, how do I start? Sorry. James.
Okay, well then, on Russia, they I mean, a specific difference is that and on the other countries in the post-Soviet space, it was an interesting question. And I think one thing to remember is that the country that wanted to get out of the Soviet Union the most was Russia, because there's all of its of these other entities that were part of the Soviet Union were essentially dependencies. So it's not surprising. Also, the fact that they were integrated in, to the extent that they were integrated into the Soviet industrial system, once they were cut off by borders, things fell apart very rapidly for them. So it's not surprising that you had even sharper fall outside of Russia than you had within it, and slower recovery. The recovery has been quite dramatic in the last 20 years, and partly because it has retreated from the neoliberal and completely predatory experience of the 1990s. I also wanted just to say a word about this very interesting question that just came up from Andrew Fisher about how in the 1980s, how things developed so that in the 1990s, there was a considerable re-centralization of fiscal control, which was something that I kind of stumbled into as I was there in that period. And people would talk about macroeconomic control, which to me, of course, meant monetary policy, fiscal policy deficits. And I learned, no, that's not it. What they meant by macroeconomic control was the ability of the central government to extract tax revenue from the provinces, who were effectively the centers of economic power. Central government was a very diminished force at that point. And this, of course, being able to do that does mean, as Andrew says, that you can have some capacity to redistribute regionally. And it's a regional balancing out, which accounts for the peaking of inequality in China as a whole. Basically, initially, all the income's concentrated in Guangdong and in Shanghai and Beijing, and then it expands out to the other provinces along the coast and then elsewhere. And that is what gives you a transition in the overall increase of inequality that occurred in the 1990s. So this is, I think, a very significant development. Thanks.
The only thing I'd add to this is the last bit of conversation and the questions remind me to think about scale, and in scale meaning literally spatial and demographic scales, but within that, then the implications for how order is constructed, economically and politically, top down and bottom up. And thus the manner in which these questions are answered in China take on literally dimensions that won't happen in a smaller space. And I think that matters. And if you think, in economics, the logic is not to think in terms of political borders, but to think in terms of economic relations. But it's impossible in politics not to take those borders seriously and the structures therein. So I'm just noting that a lot of what this fine discussion about China has been about is intimately related to scale and the way in which we understand comparisons among different places.
Just 1 minute, very brief note, actually, which doesn't have, unfortunately, much to do with the question, because I think it's a very broad question. And I totally agree with Ben that the scale, of course, between East European countries and China, the comparison is really nowadays rather really relevant. I mean, it was not like that, as we know from Isabella's book before. But with the Chinese influence on Europe and European thinking, I just want to mention something because I'm writing about that now. It's Quesnay and the French physiocrats were very much influenced by China. So that influence really goes into the origins of economics, and obviously that goes to Adam Smith, but Quesnay was, of course, a big sort of proponent of the Chinese system in many ways.
Yeah, great. So on the question of what can we learn from China, I think one important lesson that emerges from China's trajectory is that there is no magic bullet of development, and that it requires incredibly careful research of experiences of other countries that does not only entail looking what they have done, but also under what conditions have they done what and why did it work? And then a very careful study of the local conditions to see if the policies that have been used elsewhere might be adapted in some creative fashion. So from that perspective, I think that development becomes really more of an exercise in guerrilla warfare rather than using one big plan or blueprint that can be transferred into another context easily. On Branko's point on Quesnay and the physiocrats, I find this also incredibly important to look at the history of economic thought not only as a one-way street from Europe to the East, but to recognize that the history of economic thought going back to the physiocrats and possibly even earlier was very much a multi-directional dialogue between different civilizations and states and cultural contexts. And in the book, what I've tried to do is to take that insight seriously in studying a more recent episode in trying to uncover some of the long-term historical roots. I would like to thank everybody so much for joining the panel today and for your wonderful comments and your appreciation of my work. This is incredibly humbling and really, really great. Thank you so much for joining and for taking the time, and also Zhongjin for taking the time to facilitate this.
Thank you, Isabella. And I'll just add an economist comment, since there are almost 200 people still on the call. You have only scratched the surface in this. Don't think you've exhausted this book. You will not have an idea until you have actually bought the thing and read it, and also buy extra copies for your friends and family.
Yeah, I want to apologize that we don't have enough time to go over all the questions, but now we have more reasons to read Isabella's books, and you'll find some of her answers there. So thank you again, Isabella, for your great research and for presenting your work with us. And thank Professor James Galbraith, Professor Wong, and Professor Branko for sharing your insightful comments here. Thanks everyone for your participation and questions. I also want to thank Caitlin and Evan in the background to moderate the questions and make this happening, as well as Perry and the economics department and UMass Amherst for supporting this event. The recorded talk will soon be posted on YouTube. Okay, thank you everyone. And thanks Isabella again for your book talk. Okay, this ends for today's book talk. Thanks everyone, bye.
Thank you so much everyone, thank you.
Bye.